right, a little Christmas tradition. So the last few years, my family and I, we have lived in Denver, Colorado. And so what we would do for Christmas was we would begin the day after Thanksgiving, and Dad would always fly up for Thanksgiving. Sometimes Mom would fly up. And then on that Friday, we would all load in the car, minus Mom, because she can't do altitude. And we would drive into the mountains, and we would chop Christmas trees down. Oh, yes, it was beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. You're just driving through these winding pathways. There's wild animal and llama out there, and then you traipse through the woods, and with nothing but a machete and a handsaw, like Paul Bunyan, I would chop down the family Christmas tree. And after the first year, we supposed that we would find a tree in the same exact spot. And so the next year we went there. And we did. And it was beautiful, more beautiful than the first. And the next year, the same thing. And the next year. And then we supposed to find it in the same spot last year. Didn't see anything. Guys, I don't know how this works in your house, but in my house, I do the work of the tree, but Ab chooses the tree. So supposing the tree would be on the right side of the road was incorrect this year because she fixed her eyes on a patch of trees on the left side of the road. The problem with the left side of the road is that it's a winding frozen river that goes all through it. And it's all covered with snow, and you can't really tell where it is. But she wanted that tree. So, me and the kids started going out there. We turned around. Dad, where are you? He said, I think I'm going to sit out this year. Oh, really? Yeah, I'm just going to sit out this year. So we go through. Of course, we step through the ice a number of times. We're soaking wet. Our jeans are freezing to our legs, but we made it to that tree. We chopped that tree down. I got so mad in the middle of it, I walked away. I walked away because you're doing all this for the love of the family, right? We're creating memories and experiences. And in the middle of it, my son's like, this is the stupidest thing ever. Why can't we just go to Home Depot like every other normal family and get a Christmas tree? I said, you shut your stupid mouth and pick up this tree. We are making memories and you're going to like it. We made it back, tied the tree to the top of the roof, and brought her home. Stood it up, beautiful. Didn't realize that was going to be the last year that I'd be chopping trees down in the woods. So now this year, we are here. Now, I'm supposing to create a similar experience. So I said, we're going to go to one of these fancy tree lots that have the lights out and you feel like you're under the stars and it's going to be beautiful. And I'm out there and the mosquitoes are biting me. There are people everywhere. Just about the time you touch a tree, like this is the one. Somebody's taking it and is walking off with it. So we find this beautiful tree. We suppose this is the tree. I asked the guy before I took it, I said, how much is this? He said, that's $285. A few minutes later, my wife picked me up. And we left the tree lot where I had supposed us to get a tree. And we went back to the circus tent over the asphalt at the Home Depot, where, like every other normal family, we bought a Christmas tree. Now, here's the thing. There are times that we suppose that God must always be in the extraordinary. Like, it's got to be something amazing. If it's God, it has to be picturesque. It has to be always fantastic. But what if God sometimes is in the ordinary. See, our family Christmas tree sometimes came out of one forest chopped down by myself. But other times it just came out of a circus tent on the asphalt. But it's a beautiful Christmas tree in the living room, and nobody knows where it came from. Well, now you all do. But I wonder how many times we miss God, supposing that he's in one place when actually he's in another. So check this out. Luke chapter 2, we're going to begin reading in verse 43. Now, to just set this up, Jesus is 12 years old, and he has been taken with his family to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And how we're going to do Christmas this year is we're going to start at this point when Jesus is 12, and each week we're just going to back our way up all the way until the birth. And the reason why is not my attempt at creativity. It's just that I feel like I've preached the beginning of Luke 2 so much, I'm almost, I want to make sure I don't miss stuff. And it seems like once Jesus is born, we just skip over the other stuff because Jesus at 12 isn't very inspiring for the first of our year. But it's going to be hugely inspirational for this moment. So let's take here 12 years old in the temple. Verse 43. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it, but supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem, searching for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us so?" He was a teenager. "Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress." And he said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" And they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. They supposed Jesus to be in the group, but Jesus was somewhere else. This is something that we see throughout this narrative from the beginning. Joseph supposed that Mary had done something that she had not done, so he was going to put her away. There were moments in life here where they were supposing to find God in one place, and yet he was always in another. They supposed him to be in the group. They went for miles traveling without Jesus with them. And then one day, suddenly they realized he's not here. Now, what I love about this story is when they discovered that Jesus was not where they were, they went back to the last place where they knew he was. That's good advice for us today. When we find ourselves having walked away from where God was and we no longer feel his presence with us, it just makes good sense for us to go back to that place where we knew he was, where we might find him rather than supposing him to be over here. If you've stepped too far away from the presence of God or the anointing of God and it just doesn't feel like it should feel, could I just encourage you that God is still in that place where he wants you to be? But sometimes we have to look for him. They supposed that he was in the group, but he was actually back in Jerusalem. And here in this story, we kind of see this collision of what is ordinary and what was extraordinary. We see this moment where he says, "I must be in my Father's house." We see this moment where he is astonishing people, but they didn't grasp it. because they supposed that he would just be doing the thing that everyone else was doing, which was being in the group. So let's consider this. Let's just see how we got here. There's a prophecy spoken by Isaiah in chapter 7 and verse 14. It says, therefore, God himself will give you a sign. The virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call him Emmanuel. Now that is extraordinary. That is fascinating that a virgin would conceive and bear a son. But then we see another prophecy where things aren't so phenomenal. In Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, it says, you, O Bethlehem, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, shall come forth from you for me, the one who is to be ruler in Israel, from days of old, from ancient of days. So now we have this prophecy that is saying that this very king that would be born of a virgin would actually be born in Bethlehem. So we have this astronomical, this extraordinary astronomical event, and yet happening in a very ordinary town. And we know that this was the place because there was a star that shone over Bethlehem. And we hear this part of the story sometimes. We start throwing in wise men. By the way, we're just going to talk about some stuff through Christmas that I'm going to assume most of you knew. Even if you didn't grow up in church, you have a pretty good idea of who wise men were. What we sometimes miss is how they actually got there. So we see this moment dating way back before the wise men. Actually, when the children of God were just wandering around in the wilderness. And there was a prophet who was not a prophet of God, but he was a prophet who heard from God, and he made this prophecy about Israel in chapter 24 and verse 17 of the book of Numbers. He said, I see him, but not near. I behold him, but not now. A star shall go out of Jacob, and the scepter shall rise out of Israel. And so we see this star now happening in a place, and we see that it's to depict this ruler that would come. Now, what's interesting to me about that is Balaam would sort of be the beginning of these wise men that would be like under Babylon or Nebuchadnezzar. And so we kind of go through the story and we see these wise men of Nebuchadnezzar later, much later after this time in the wilderness. People like Daniel were tasked to be among them. And then we see that nation kind of fall apart. We see Israel have left already and then kind of push it further a little east. And now there are people who are still holding on to some of these prophecies, one being this prophecy about a star. And so we have these wise men who are far away from Israel, and yet they have this prophecy that a star is going to denote where this fascinating person was going to come from. And so they just follow the star. They get to this place in Israel. They don't know exactly where the king would be born. And now they have to search for these priests and these scribes. So they go to Herod, and he brings priests and scribes together. And they say, yes, there was a prophecy about this king and that he would be born in Bethlehem. So we see this kind of amazing star moment, and yet this really, really boring town. And by an amazing display, God decided to announce what he was doing in an otherwise less than extraordinary city. We can never see God in just the amazing. It's sometimes just that day-to-day routine where we have to find him. It's in those day-to-day moments where we're just being faithful. It's those day-to-day moments where we're just persevering. It's those day-to-day moments where we just decide to get into the Word, even though it really doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. It's just Tuesday. I mean, like, we get Sunday. Let's jump into the Word on Sunday. Let's worship Jesus on Sunday. But like Thursday, I mean, let's pray on Wednesday night. Let's come in here and wake up heaven. But I mean, Saturday morning, cartoons are on, right? But yet it's in the ordinary where God is found and in the extraordinary where God is found. And we have to learn to discern where is God and not suppose that he's just there or suppose that he's just here. But rather, as we walk with him and we know him, then we begin to understand where he is, and where he is where we stay. We saw this with John the Baptist. John was born just prior to Jesus. Another miracle, another amazing thing that God did. His parents were older, they had not conceived. God spoke to John's dad through an angel, told him what was going to happen. His dad didn't believe it. He said, how? Not in the way that Mary said, how can this be? It wasn't a question that was searching for an answer that would build faith. Rather, it was an argument. I know all the time we say, well, God doesn't mind our questions. God doesn't mind questions when our questions are searching for an answer that will build our faith. When our questions are set on the purpose of denying something that God has said, our questions will lead us to a bad place. There are some questions we need to be careful about. There are some places where our questions will seek to take us that will distract us from faith rather than take us to it. When you understand what you're searching for, because what you're searching for has been promised through the Word, you follow that and it will take you to the place where God is. And so Zechariah was just in this place and he asked this question. Because he did not believe what God had said through the angel, he could not speak until his son was born. So now we have John, this extraordinary figure. And people are watching him do his thing and they're kind of questioning like, but it's just this guy wearing boring clothes in the wilderness. How can this be fantastic? They were looking for all the fanfare that they were seeing back at the temple or back at Herod's palace, and they're looking for all of this, but that's not what they're seeing in the wilderness, and they brought the question up to Jesus. And in Luke chapter 7 and verse 24, he said, what did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? What did you go out to see then? A man dressed in soft clothing? Behold, people who dress in splendid clothes and live in luxury are in king's courts. But what did you go out to see? You went to see a prophet. Yes, and I tell you much more than a prophet, for he is the one who will bring forth the Messiah. Just a guy wearing camel's clothes, or camel's hair as clothes, right? Like a guy that just ate bugs. Not the delicacies of the palace. And yet he would be the one whom they were tasked, who they were called to listen to. Sometimes we're always looking for a flashy suit. We miss God's word through someone very ordinary. I was with a buddy one time. We went through the McDonald's drive-thru. And the lady at the drive-thru window looks at him. She didn't know him. And she spoke a word to him. And it was kind of a weird moment. Like, I don't know that I'm all for McDonald's prophecies. But when she said something to him, like, it kind of resonated. And we pull away and he goes, I don't get it. What? What don't you get? I mean, Pastor Reggie, he just sits on the front row and Kenneth E. Hagin prophesies to him and I get the McDonald's lady. But here's the thing. A word from God is a word from God. And there are times that we're not in a position to hear something from this person or that person. But God will get his word to you regardless. So we respect the word. We respect the anointing upon the word. And when you walk with Jesus long enough, you'll be able to tell the difference. So they supposed that Jesus was here when Jesus was really there. And then when they find him, he says, "Didn't you know?" They supposed he was here, and they supposed he was there, but when they got to him, he said, "Didn't you know?" That just tells me that there is a knowing that we can have. We don't have to go through life always supposing, is he here, is he there, is God doing this, is God doing that? There is a knowing that we can be sure of, and in that place, we'll see and know God move. So let me throw it out there like this. There are 3 things that I absolutely know that I am to be a part of. 1 is I'm a husband. 2, I'm a dad. 3, I'm a preacher. Those 3 things I absolutely know. I know those. Now, sometimes I suppose that I can play basketball, or I suppose that I can play golf, or I suppose that I'm Iron Man. Sometimes I can suppose those things. But what I know is that I am a husband, I am a dad, I am a preacher. And those 3 realities, I know God is in those spaces with me. Now here's what can happen. There can sometimes be conflict between the spaces. There sometimes is demand from children that creates conflict now because now there's not enough time for my spouse. Sometimes there's demand from preaching that now creates conflict where I cannot spend as much time with my children. But here's the thing. When I know God is in these places, it forces me to let them live in harmony with each other. So that I know this. If I spend too much time at work so that it's costing my relationship with my spouse, I have no choice but to spend less time at work. Why? Because the gain by spending more time at work is not as much as the loss by not spending time with my wife. I can spend this much time with my children and drag them here and drag them there and drag them all over the place, but the benefit that will bring them might not measure the benefit that would be spent to spending a little more time at work so that maybe there is extra so that at Christmas time I can give them something that I could not have given them if I would have spent time just running here and there. Right? Like, it's this constant, we're having to layer where God is over top of itself so that we can know that I'm supposed to be doing this. See, I know that I'm not supposed to spend too much time in any area that creates too much conflict with another. I know that. I can suppose some things and I can step into what I suppose, but then when I find it not working, I have to step back so that I go back to the place that I know. And I realize that gets a little bit, we don't really like people kind of getting too much into our business, but here's the thing. If spending so much more time at work just advances my career, but I lose my household, what have I gained? See, yeah, but aren't you just setting yourself up for mediocrity? No, I'm not. I'm setting myself up to succeed in the 3 places where God has called me. And He hasn't called me to succeed as a preacher to the detriment of my family. And so I have to work both. And sometimes I suppose Him to be more over here, but when I get there, I realize, no, He's back there. And I have to keep ping-ponging, if you will, moving back and forth. But something has to be constant. I have to be, because that's what He's called me to be. A husband, a father, a preacher. And I can know these things and live in that space. And so Mary, she comes to this moment. She has this conversation with Jesus. He says, didn't you know that? You could have known that because remember when shepherds showed up when I was born? Remember that? Remember when the angel talked to you before you and Joseph were ever married? Like, do you remember all that? He didn't have to go into all that. All he had to say was, didn't you know? She had all the moments where she could have known. See, I do believe this. I do believe God speaks to us all the time, and sometimes we just push through what he says, and rather than holding on to it or writing it down, we now get 2 years removed from a word for God that would have helped steer us, but we forgot about it. And so here's where we step into this part of the text that's beautiful to me. It says she treasured up these things in her heart. Okay, maybe she should have known, but she didn't know. And so now that she has this moment, she takes the moment and she treasures it up in her heart. When we recognize that we're on a pathway that's not exactly leading us to the place where we need to go, it makes sense for us to back up, but it also makes sense for us to take the moment and treasure the moment up in our heart, because that moment that we treasure in our heart, that we meditate on, will keep us from doing the same thing over and over and over again. She treasured up these things in her heart. I ask you this, can you trust your heart? Do you live in such a way that you've treasured up what should be treasured up, where you trust your heart to lead you in the right direction? We see this conversation actually back in Luke chapter 2 and verse 19. When the shepherds came to Mary and they said, "This is what angels told us." It said she treasured up these things, pondering them in her heart. We'd seen the phrase before. She'd done it before. How do we have a heart that can be trusted? What are we pondering on? What are we treasuring up in our heart and pondering? See, I find myself sometimes being filled with all sorts of distractions, all sorts of news, all sorts of conversations that have absolutely nothing to do with these things that God has called me to do. They have nothing to do with me as a parent or me as a preacher or me as a husband. Nothing to do with all that. It's just noise. It's just a lot of noise that I just consume. And when I consume all this noise, what happens is my heart can no longer be trusted, because I've filled it with more of that stuff than the principal stuff. Sometimes we're living a lifestyle where we're wanting God to encourage us. We're wanting God to motivate us. We're wanting God to take the frustration away. And the problem is we're filling ourselves with so much information that is frustrating us. God can't send enough people to encourage us. We need to do better about auditing where we place our attention. If we place hours of our attention on social, and at the end of that, spending time in those spaces just scrolling, we're actually more frustrated or we're more depressed, here's an idea: spend less time there. It's just a thought. See, I've watched this. I can be in the car with my kids. We can be having a great old time. Somebody will see something and all of a sudden they're in a bad mood. I'm thinking, how are we in a bad mood? Nothing's happened. Traffic's fine. We're still going where we're going. What happened? Somebody chose to let something from outside into that space and discouraged a moment that should not have been discouraged, not because of anything that happened in the car, but because of something that happened outside that we chose to let in. We need to have enough sense to guard our hearts and not let so much stuff in that's frustrating us. Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 23 says, keep your heart, keep it. For from it flows the springs of life. We have to guard what we let in. Now here's how we see Mary do this. She stored these things up. What was she storing up in her heart? What God was doing, what God was saying. Psalm 119:11. I have stored up your words in my heart that I might not sin against you. Sometimes we wonder why we say the things that we say that we don't want to say. It's because we've been watching everyone else say the things that we don't want to say. We just turn the TV on and just let it spew conversations into our lives that we're going to turn around and repeat. We will absolutely turn around and repeat them. We listen to stuff over and over. I have a real problem personally with earworms. What that means is I can hear a song and like it lives forever. I have this just a plethora of knowledge of rock songs from the 80s and 90s. If you want to know something about hair bands, I'm your guy. I can tell you about all of them. I could be in a store, barely hear it, and I'll tell my kids, shh. Def Leppard, 1984. Like, I can tell you the year they wrote the song. So I have to watch that. Now, you may not have an issue with that, but I have to watch that. I don't have any secular stations on my radio for that reason. Why? Because if I'm expecting to be able to trust my heart to speak words from God, I can't fill it up with lyrics from Vince Neil. See, if I do, then I can't speak words from God. James said, how can bitter water and good water come out of the same mouth? Like, I can't do that. Now, you're going to have something different. You're going to have something else that conflicts with what God has called you to do, and you have to make sure you're putting more of His word in your heart instead of that so that you don't sin against Him. For you, it very well may not be those things. Another thing I have to watch, I have to watch it. When I was growing up, when I was a teenager, man, I had the foulest mouth you've ever heard. Like, ever. So even to this day, now don't get offended by this. Even to this day, somebody pulls out in front of me, I don't say it, but that's what I'm hearing up here. I pull up, there's toys and junk all in the front row. What in the world? Now here's the thing. If I watch a bunch of stuff with all of that, now all of a sudden, rather than just thinking something, because I'm keep putting it in me, now all of a sudden it's not just something that goes past that I have to cast down. See, we have to put down those vain words. Now it's not something that I can just put down. I put so much of it in me, now that's what's actually coming out. Thank God we're not judged for the stupidity that flashes across our minds, but we are judged by the words we speak. And if what we're putting in is encouraging us to say things that we've been commanded not to say, we can pray all day long. Lord, take these words away from me. In the name of, just on and on and on. And then sit down in front of the TV and just keep watching them. What are we doing? What are we doing? It might be spending for you. You might just spend yourself into a hole all the time. Here's an idea. If you don't need something, don't go shopping. It's just a thought. You can drop me in a mall, and I can tell you I will have no problem buying nothing. It's of no temptation to me. I don't like to shop. I don't like to be in the mall. My skin crawls at the mall. Crawls. Like I feel myself like seizing in the middle of the mall. It's not something I deal with. See, music might not be your thing, or movies might not be your thing that you have to deal with. Maybe it is. Maybe it's spending too much. Maybe it's saying things that you should. Like, what is it? See, that's where you have to guard your heart to not let that in. Here's the thing about life. It's pretty easy. We're going through like trying to find the magic text in the gospel. I guarantee you He has already given you guiding words that lead you in what He's called you to do, and He's given you guiding warnings so that you can neglect the thing that will destroy you. I guarantee you it's no surprise in your life what you need to put in your heart and what you need to keep away. Because life is not a mystery. God has made it very clear to each and every one of us the things that we put in, that we need, that will help us be better at what we're being, and the things to push away that will make it worse. We have to watch our heart. See, we saw this to King Saul. The people wanted a king. They all wanted a king. God didn't want them to have a king, but they wanted a king, so He gave them the king that they wanted. God gave them the king that they wanted. And the king that they wanted, that God gave them, began by hearing the words of God and obeying the words of God. And then he quit hearing the words of God and obeying the words of God. And then we see this moment where the prophet says something to him. In 1 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 13, the prophet Samuel says this to Saul. He says, "Your kingdom will not continue. For God has sought out a man after His own heart, and has commanded him to be king over his people because you did not keep the command God gave you. I don't want to be replaced. I love being added to, but I don't want to be replaced. What is the difference between being useful and replaced? My heart. We have to guard our hearts that we might not sin against him. This is actually how the whole thing began with Mary. In Luke chapter 1 and verse 29, it said that the angel came to her and said, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God." How do we find favor with God? Genesis chapter 6 and verse 8, it says, Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. He was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. I absolutely believe in the grace of God, the unmerited grace of God that God just offers. But what I also believe is that I have to find it. It is there. It is available. It has been given to me, but I have to find favor. How do we find favor? By keeping the commands of God, we find the favor of God. And by being obedient in that place, we find more favor and more favor and more favor. See, when you sit there and think, yeah, like when you're talking about balancing between family and work, like how's that supposed to work? You just make it work. You say, well, what am I supposed to tell them? Like, I can't do that. I can't do that to my family. Yeah. And here's the other thing. When you have the favor of God, you are so awesome at what you do, they're not going to let you go because they're going to look at you and say, we got to keep this guy. So in order to keep that person, they will actually change policies, not to just for you, but it will affect everybody. Your standing up for the kingdom will cause great effect for that company. Say to you, I absolutely believe that. Everybody was not allowed to pray. What happened? Daniel decided he was going to pray. What did they do? They threw him in a lion's den. What did they do when they pulled him out? They changed the policy. They changed the policy. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what did they do? They said, we're not bowing down. They threw him in a fiery furnace. What happened? Jesus showed up. What did they do? They changed policy. There was a church, big church, Life Church, Craig Rochelle's church out of Oklahoma. And they were expanding and adding campuses, and they said, we were finding that there was a sudden spike in divorce rates among our staff. And they were bothered by it, and they looked back and they realized that they were expanding too quickly, and they didn't have the staff support to do it. And people were being worked way too many hours, and it was having terrible effects on their family. And so even though the church was growing, families were being destroyed. And they said, we pushed pause and stepped back and changed things. Why? Because it was affecting families. That's what good leaders do. Some of you that are in leadership positions, it's not to just add to a certain bottom line. God has given you leadership over people under you, and you need to be concerned not just with what you pay them, but how their lives are. You need to be concerned with how is this change, how is this policy, how is it going to affect their families? Look, we're all in this together. All of us, we're all in this together to move forward and experience the fullness that God has for us. And sometimes it's something as ordinary as a policy. And sometimes it's as extraordinary as a star shining over a tiny town, announcing that the Son of God has been born. She pondered these things in her heart. Jesus was 12. The first time it says she pondered these things in her heart was 12 years before that moment. I wonder, and I'm going to finish with this, I wonder how many of us are living in the center of what God was setting us up for 12 years ago. I wonder what God started in us 12 years ago. I wonder what he was saying to us 12 years ago that we've pondered in our hearts that we are seeing today. Or how many of us just kind of forgot about all that and we're just starting over? Here's the beautiful thing about God. He's always there for the redo. And some of you look at it and you say, yeah, I don't think I'm where I should be right now. Like, I think about that. God spoke to me last year. He spoke to me 7 years ago, and I just, rather than pondering it, I just kind of forgot about it. 1 week ago, last year, so a whole year back 1 week, so 53 weeks ago, I was praying on a Saturday night before I was going to preach on a Sunday. And as I was praying in that Streams auditorium, in that section where the Andersons and the Obornis and the Hales sit, I believe the Lord whispered to me. And I was just praying, and I began to do this. And he said, in the fullness of time, this will all become clear. As the time draws near, this will all become clear. And I knew it wasn't just that moment. It wasn't just being in that building. It wasn't just being in that town. But rather, it was before that, even 12 years before that, in 2007, as a graduate student at Southeastern University, when the call of God solidified to preach the gospel. And that journey from that moment to right now was a 12-year journey that took me all over the place. To take my place where God had called me. Now here's the thing. If it works for a simple preacher in a simple town, does it not work for you? What should you ponder in your heart? What plans does God have? And will you be brave enough to not suppose he's there or suppose he's there, but to know where he is and follow him?